What is the state of transit right now in Canada? If that's your question, well, you've come to the right show. I'm Paul Comfort, and this is Transit Unplugged, the world's top podcast that interviews top executives around the world who take you behind the scenes of their transit agency and talk about trends in the industry. On today's episode, we focus on the nation of Canada as we come to an end of our six-part series on the state of transit. We speak with a good friend of mine, Dave Reage. Dave is chair of the Canadian Urban Transit Association, or CUTA. We were just up at their conference recently and filmed an episode of Transit Unplugged TV while we were there in Montreal, which is airing right now on YouTube. On today's episode, though, Dave talks about funding and financial stability of Canadian transit. We talk about ridership trends, demand patterns, some service challenges across the nation. We also talk about innovation and technology and a whole lot more. Dave gives us a behind-the-scenes look from someone who has been active as a leader in transit across Canada for a couple decades. And as I mentioned, this is bringing us close to the end of our six-part series on Transit Unplugged on the state of transit. We've had some great guests. Next week, we wrap it all up with Hayden Clarkin. Hayden is a top influencer in the public transportation industry with tens of thousands of followers on social media. He's normally known as the Transit Guy. You can look him up everywhere under the Transit Guy. And he's going to give us, from his perspective, hot topics across the industry. And that'll wrap up our six-part series. Looking forward to having you join us in February for what we're calling Fantastic February. We kick it off with a fantastic guest, Roger Harris, president of Amtrak, America's national railroad. Great to have him on the show on our February 4th episode. And then right after that, the next week on the 11th, we'll have Bridget Beato. She's chair of WTS. I've recorded her live and in person while we were at the TRB conference in Washington, D.C. just recently. I know you're going to enjoy all the episodes coming up. A great look at transit and a fantastic February. Today, let's talk to my good friend Dave Reage about Canadian transit right now on Transit Unplugged. Great to have my pal Dave Reage with us. Dave, thanks for doing the show today.
My pleasure, Paul. Glad to be here.
Yeah, Dave and I met a few years ago in detail. We've met before, but when he was head of the Halifax Transit system, we filmed one of my favorite episodes ever of Transit Unplugged TV in your city of Halifax, Dave. I mean, I'd never been there before, and it is just phenomenal, dude.
It's a gem, and I don't think anyone who visits it ever comes away disappointed. It's so certainly encourage people to come visit us. Lots to do as a tourist, for sure.
We were just talking in the green room about, I don't think our friend Robin Gabriels will remind me saying this, but when we were there filming, it was also during a CUTA conference, Canadian Urban Transit, and I interviewed Robin, who was the head of Guelph at the time, their transit system, and said, hey, how do you like, Halifax? And he said, well, it's the first time I've been here. And he said, I think I really like it. I love the water. And I guess within a year, your job came open because you moved up in the city and he ended up there. So now he's got your old job running the transit system.
No, that's it. It's like I say, you come there in the summer, you won't want to leave.
Tell us a little bit about Halifax, where it's at,
Sure.
What are some of the highlights, that kind of stuff.
No, absolutely. So Halifax is the capital of the province of Nova Scotia on Canada's east coast. So it is a port town, very historic city. And, home to Canada's East Coast military, and really the regional hub for Atlantic Canada, a city that's grown rapidly in the past 5 years. We were one of the fastest growing cities in Canada, and, our population now a little over 500,000 people. So, but it's really a place that is, despite rapid growth, has managed to maintain its character as a wonderful, historic, welcoming, friendly place, a place I'm very proud to call home.
Dave, talk about the whole connection with the Titanic. I know that's interesting to people. It's something that I knew about, but I wasn't prepared for the emotional impact of visiting the cemetery and all that. I mean, it's wild. Tell people a little about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, when the Titanic disaster happened, a lot of the rescue efforts were launched out of Halifax, and a lot of the folks who were deceased were brought back to Halifax as one of the closest major ports. And so there is actually a cemetery two cemeteries in Halifax, actually, where victims of the Titanic are actually buried. So a lot of folks that come in on cruise ships, the first thing to do is get off a boat and go to the Titanic cemetery, which is a little interesting choice, I think.
Kind of ironic,
boat, but it is a very powerful and emotional connection to that piece of history, for sure.
And one thing that's interesting for us on the East Coast is you guys are an hour ahead of us into the Atlantic time zone.
We are, yeah. The Atlantic time zone, 1 hour off. And I'll say it's probably the worst time zone though for watching professional sports because everything starts an hour later. And during the Blue Jays run last summer or last fall, a lot of us were up pretty late watching those games, starting at 9 and 10 o'clock Atlantic time.
So we're going to get to Canadian trends and all like that for the last like 2/3 of the show. But would you mind talking a little about your transit system a little bit and kind of the scope of it and what you all offer there in Halifax?
Sure. So yeah, so Halifax Transit, and my background is I was with Halifax Transit for 18 years. I was in charge of Halifax Transit for 9 years, and again have since moved into this role new role about a year ago. But Halifax Transit is the largest transit system in Atlantic Canada. Right? We're actually bigger than every other system in Atlantic Canada combined. So we really are kind of the biggest regional system. About 400 buses and 5 harbor ferries, which is really one of the more unique things about us. Us and Vancouver are really the two Canadian transit systems that have a ferry component. And it dates back to actually to, the origins of the ferry system go back to the 1700s, which is, pretty incredible. Now, in the 1700s, it was one guy in a rowboat taking people home from the bars at the end of the night. So we've evolved quite a way from that into 5 sophisticated diesel-powered ferries.
One of the highlights of my visit was when you and I rode your ferry and you got me to sit in the captain's chair, like, because you're in charge of it, so you could put me there.
Yeah, we made you an honorary captain that day.
Yeah. And, since then, recently I was in Connecticut and they actually let me drive their ferry across.
Oh, wow.
And all the way in. Now, the captain had his hand on something there. But
yeah, he had his hand on the red button, I'm sure, in case anything went wrong.
No cars or people were harmed during the filming of this one.
That's a blast.
Yeah. Anyway, so tell us now about what you're doing now. You mentioned the title and what your responsibilities are in your new role because you got promoted.
Yeah. So the new role is basically moving into the operations realm and more into long range planning. So my mandate is long range planning around infrastructure and broad transportation planning. So including transit, but also into active transportation, vehicular traffic in general, goods movement, things like that. And really it came about because Halifax traditionally grew slow and steady, 1% to 2% per year. But with the rapid growth we've seen, we fell behind the curve in the areas of infrastructure and transportation. So there was a need seen for this type of role. And I was fortunate enough to be the one who was able to go into it. So it's really fascinating. You really get to map out the future of the city, which is just great fun. I mean, I grew up playing SimCity as a kid, so it's a little bit like that now coming true in real life to be able to plan that far out.
That's awesome, dude. And so also in the role as head of the transit system, and now here you've been working your way up at CUTA, the Canadian Urban Transit Association.
Yeah.
So this year you are the chair, right?
That's right, Paul. So yeah, I joined the board of CUTA about 10 years ago, worked my way through the board, the executive committee, and last May was named chair of CUTA. So, CUTA's been so close to my life and my career. My first interaction with CUTA was actually back in 2003 as a delegate at their second ever youth summit or young leaders summit, we call it now. So to be able to give back to the organization that has been such a huge part of my career going forward and has opened so many doors for me and opportunities. I'm so thankful to have the opportunity and privilege of leading CUTA. I'm almost a year into it now, so I have a year and a bit left on my mandates. And
is it a 2-year term?
It's a 2-year term. Yeah,
okay.
2-year term as chair. Just so happy to be able to have that opportunity to lead the Canadian transit industry.
That's awesome, man. Yeah. So we should call out Marco D'Angelo, who was the executive director, great guy. And then I also want to shout out to Mike Bismeyer, who's chair of the business group. And he was the one that gave me the idea to do this series with you and CTAA when we were at the last CUTA conference, wherever that was at, Montreal, I guess.
We were in Montreal, yeah. That's right. We were out at one of the final events of the conference, and Mike had the light bulb go off, and that's all it takes sometimes for a great idea to come forward.
Yeah. So this is why one of the reasons why we did this 2-part series with you and the head of CTA, Community Transportation Association of America, as part of our overall series on the state of transit in North America. And so we wanted to dive into kind of a little bit now about Canadian transit. Why don't you talk about Canadian transit in general? give us an overall view, and then let's dive into some of the funding and the ridership trends and service challenges, innovation, those kind of things. But talk to us about transit in general across Canada.
Sure. So the interesting, I mean, I guess, keeping with the theme of, comparing between Canada and the United States, it's interesting because there's a lot of similarities between the two, obviously, like most things between our two countries. But then there's also a lot of differences. I mean, the governance structures tend to be quite different in Canada. Far more prevalent is where transit systems are a department of city government or municipal government rather than a separate commission. I know that model is far more frequently used in the US. But also just the kind of broad scale and scope of transit systems, everything from the TTC, which is the largest in Canada, serving Canada's largest city, all the way up to transit systems serving some of our Northern Territory capitals like Whitehorse and Yellowknife. So, it's, especially when you look at the scope of the mandate of the Canadian Urban Transit Association, in my role as chair, I'm there to make sure the needs of everything from Toronto to Whitehorse are being met through CUTA.
And what are some of the things that CUTA has on its plate this year?
Yeah, I mean, there's never a dull moment. Right now, funding is one of the biggest conversations, as you might imagine. Fiscal sustainability is one of the biggest challenges facing transit systems across the country. And there's the capital piece of that, and there's funding programs out there for that. But the operating funding piece is actually probably even the more crucial piece. Right now in Canada, since COVID, we've had really significant inflation, and that's across all sectors. The cost for transit agencies to do business is going up. So really, trying to find ways to fund transit on the operating side. And that's actually I'd say an interesting difference between Canada and the United States, where I know in the US, a lot of the transit systems that are kind of run through commissions may have like a sales tax provision or things like that help fund it. The vast majority of operational funding in Canada actually comes from property taxes and fares. Cost recovery, I think, is like mid 30% on average across the country.
That's your average? That's pretty good, dude. We're down well into the teens here, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because a big difference between Canada and the US, like that used to be higher. When I first joined Halifax Transit, as an example, I think we were around 70% cost recovery, which I would say is a good indication that you're not providing enough off-peak service. Like that, if your cost recovery is that high, your service levels aren't high enough. Depending on property tax, it is a challenge for sure.
So I was just in Washington, D.C. Last week for a conference, and we went up on Capitol Hill. We met with Mark Molinaro, who is the administrator of the Federal Transit Administration here in the U.S. We also met with House and Senate staff on the relevant committees that are doing the Reauthorization Act here in our country. And a lot of money comes to transit agencies from the federal government in the U.S. Most of it's capital, but there's also a formula fund for operating dollars. How does it work in Canada?
Yes. So right now there is no federal funding on the operating side, and that is certainly a challenge. It generally, and in some areas there is some provincial operating funding, but that is certainly not uniform across the country, and I would say is not the norm across the country. So what you have is that municipalities, who generally have the fewest options in terms of raising money through taxes, are the ones left holding the bag on really the bulk of operating funding. On the capital side, I think one of the great successes that CUTA has had over the past decade and more is the lobbying efforts, on Parliament Hill with the federal government around the push for sustainable capital transit funding, and that, full credit and kudos to the Canadian the federal government that they have responded with that. There's been funding programs in the past. We're going through right now. The Canada Public Transit Fund is kind of the new one out there, looking to see how that's going to evolve through government right now. But generally speaking, we've got great support from senior orders of government on the capital side. But it really has to go beyond the ribbon cutting and get into how do you actually pay the ongoing operating costs going forward? Because the reality is, with all the capital money out there, municipalities, may actually end up in a point where they have to turn some of that down if they can't actually afford to operate the system afterwards.
What about ridership? How is that going up there? I know that's, that may not be, I think you and I might agree on this. I don't think ridership should be the end all be all do all KPI for our industry. It's actually the one thing that we don't control. We can control safety, efficiency, reliability, and customer service more than we can ridership. But if we build it, hopefully they'll come. But how's it going up there in Canada on ridership?
No, I agree, Paul. I mean, like ridership is one metric, but yeah, it's not the sole metric. That's for sure. The answer to how is it going, especially, we're nearly 6 years post-pandemic now, which is hard to believe as a total aside, but it's been 6 years. It varies, I would say, is the best way to put it. The more commuter-based systems, like your commuter rail systems in Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, those systems have been slower to recover. And I mean, it makes sense. If you're a long distance commuter, you're going to be more likely to be trying to work from home a few days a week rather than doing the hour and a half train ride every day. So that I mean, it is still coming back, but that's been a slower growth. The interesting thing is what we've really seen, particularly in the more urban systems, is actually a shift, and it's a little bit of a shift away from very peak oriented ridership to actually seeing more off-peak ridership, more weekend ridership, which is an interesting thing because, again, I've been in the industry over 20 years. It was always that peak ridership was your bread and butter. And then you try to figure out the off-peak stuff on the fringes, but that's really that's really turning on its head. The other thing I would say is the old days of your ridership Monday to Thursday being pretty uniform, and then you see a bit of a drop off Fridays. Those days are gone now. And what we're generally seeing is Wednesday's your busiest day, Tuesday, Thursday are your next busiest days, Monday and Friday are your lightest days. So it certainly creates some new challenges and trying to line up the service levels with the demand.
How about weekends? In the U.S., we're seeing a lot of uptick in ridership on commuter rail. Now some are calling it regional rail on the weekends and nights. Unlike, like you said before, it was everybody going into the city in the morning, everybody going out in the evening. Now people are like taking it to ball games and nightlife. Are you seeing any of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and I love the change from commuter rail to regional rail because that's a very good rebrand because it isn't just for commuters. And yeah, so similarly, whether it's on the rail side or local transit side, weekend ridership is up dramatically. And, I think a lot of it comes back to, the affordability crisis that we find ourselves in. Again, I spoke about inflation, like everything's more expensive now. So we're seeing more and more people who are turning to transit either out of need or out of choice to make more trips outside of just commuting to work. So that pattern is certainly emerging in Canada as well.
Let's talk about any service challenges and operations across, in Canadian context.
The biggest one I would point to is around workforce and reliability. And the Halifax example I can give, and it's really been mirrored across the industry in Canada. It used to be that we could go out once a year, do a job posting for bus operators, fill a bank of applicants, and then draw from that bank through the year to fill training classes. And that's just not the case anymore. And I think it speaks to labor force scarcity in Canada and just the challenges, but filling bus operator roles, heavy duty truck and transport mechanics are some of the hardest trades to hire. I would say if you've got a kid who's trying to figure out what they want to do in life, send them to trade school, get their truck and transport ticket, and they will never be unemployed because that is such an in-demand trade across the country. And we all are challenged to hire those. Down to, our dispatchers, everything like that. It's a very challenging competitive market out there, much more than it used to be. Now, on the reliability side, I mean, Canadian cities are all experiencing increased congestion, which then of course makes it harder to run your transit system on time, which, makes it less attractive. And then it's a bit of a vicious circle in terms of trying to keep your ridership happy. So I would say those are probably the two biggest ones.
And is innovation, technology helping address any of that, or what is that doing in your operations up there?
When we speak about innovation and technology, the thing that would immediately come to mind would be around electrification and the efforts that we've been making there. And, on the Canadian side, we've been making great progress. There's lots of e-buses in operation. We have 60 here in Halifax, which is a great chunk of our fleet. And that's been largely mirrored across the country. But I think at the end of the day, it's, electrification is a big one, but it's one that we can't let us get distracted on and get distracted away from service provision. Because at the end of the day, it's better off to focus on innovative ways of delivering good service to the ridership. It's because your average person is going to be less concerned about how a bus, the propulsion method or fuel source for a bus, as long as that bus arrives on time, is safe, is clean, and gets them where they need to go on time. Like I feel like, I'm not sure how it's played out in the US, but in Canada, I feel like we got a little bit distracted from that in the rush to electrification. And I think that's starting to right itself now.
When I was in Montreal recently, we actually filmed an episode of our Transit Unplugged TV show, which is airing right now this month. It's a great episode with all the folks there at STM and ARTM and all them. But the thing I heard there, and I've heard, Dave, for the last year or so, is that there's also a push to do CNG, hydrogen, and other different types of fuels. Is that right still?
Hydrogen is a really interesting opportunity, and it could be the next fuel source after electric. But there's so much that's unknown right now. There's some really interesting pilots going on. The Edmonton region has been running a bus. Winnipeg has bought a couple of hydrogen buses, and they're testing them out. The biggest thing is it's actually not the bus technology. That's quite that's quite well established. It's the source. And being able to get a source of hydrogen that is clean hydrogen, and actually, because if you do hydrogen the wrong way, you can actually end up with more greenhouse gas emissions than with a diesel bus. And then what's the point? So one of the interesting things here is that on the East Coast of Canada, our provincial government is very bullish on hydrogen development from the perspective of actual potential exports to Europe, because we're on a very windy coast. Looking at the potential for wind generation to create green hydrogen. And then we're incredibly close to Europe compared to anywhere else in North America. Well, as a slight aside, we're so close that, I can get on a plane here and be in Dublin in 4 hours, where it takes me about 6 to get to the other side of my own country. So I'm actually closer to Europe than the West Coast of Canada being where we are.
That's interesting. Wow, I never thought about it that way. That's funny.
Yeah. No, it's amazing. It's great for European vacations. We're nice and close.
What other kind of innovations besides fuel stuff are you guys working on up there?
The other thing that's really taken off is around microtransit and on-demand service, which is really, I think, an interesting opportunity to fill the gaps where you're not going to send a big bus down the street every half an hour. So. Right. Being able to get into rural communities, maybe, some lighter industrial areas, your general areas, or maybe new developments where they haven't built up to the point where it justifies a full-on bus route. So, that's the other piece that's really emerging. Some parts of Canada have well-established systems in that. And the interesting piece is that really, at the end of the day, there's still a vehicle of some sort picking people up. But the thing that really lets that happen and happen well is the background technology to really effectively be able to organize and operate that service.
And where are we at when it comes to policy planning and leadership in the Canadian context?
The biggest thing coming up right now is around the long-term funding and the accountability around that, I think, around capital. If we can align stable investment with clear performance outcomes around ridership, reliability, access, emissions, housing integration, all those good things, that really changes the game. The other big factor, and I'm a land use planner by background, so this is one of the things that really excites me, is the conversation in Canada right now is really strong around the integration between transit and land use. And there's been a recognition, particularly at the federal level, the transit works best when communities build around it, and you build that proper transit-oriented development. And that's emerged in some of the criteria for transit funding, that you have to be able to show you have a plan to increase housing and that the two are connected. Because I'm not sure of the status in the US right now, but we have some pretty major housing shortages in a lot of Canadian cities. And the cost of housing, along with everything else, has gone up dramatically You're at a point now where the next generation will struggle to afford housing. The dream of living, buying your own house in the suburbs may not be a reality for many in the next generation. So that connection between transit and building more housing is really essential as we go forward from a policy perspective.
I also want to call out, I need to correct myself from earlier. I introduced Marco D'Angelo as the executive director, but his title is actually president and CEO of CUTA. And he's been a good friend of mine for years and years, has been on this show many times. And I tell you, Dave, this has been a great overview of what you all are working on up there from a federal level. What comes next for CUTA? What do you got on the queue? You got more conferences, or what's happening next?
I think our next conference will be this May in Quebec City, another beautiful, beautiful Canadian city. If folks have never been there, I strongly encourage you go. That's next up. We also, the biggest thing right now is around funding with the federal government. So we are doing some work right now. We'll be up in Ottawa. The executive committee and some of the government relations folks will be in Ottawa next month for meetings with senior federal officials. Just trying to dissect the latest announcements out of the current federal budget and understand where where we go from here in terms of ensuring that sustainable long-range funding.
Well, we wish you the very best on that. I know that's important for the continued success of transit in Canada. And thank you for being a friend to us here on Transit Unplugged. We hope to see you again at one of the upcoming conferences you've got going on. It was my honor to do a panel this last time with my friend Kevin Quinn and a couple of the others that were on the panel with us. And I look forward to continuing to work with you in transit up there and promote the value it brings to our communities.
That's great. Thanks, Paul. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you today.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Transit Unplugged, the world's #1 transit executive podcast. I'm Julie Gates, executive producer of the podcast. Many thanks to the team that makes this show happen. Host and producer Paul Comfort, producer Chris O'Keefe, editor Patrick Emile, associate producer Cindy Raskin. Transit Unplugged is being brought to you by Modaxo, passionate about moving the world's people. If you would enjoy behind-the-scenes insights and updates from the show, sign up for our weekly newsletter, which has links to can't-miss conversations with the biggest names in mobility. Head to transitunplugged.com and scroll to the bottom of the page to sign up. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Transit Unplugged.